May the words of my lips and the meditation of our hearts be always acceptable to you, O Christ, our sovereign and Redeemer. Amen.
Amen.
What does it mean to be a good person? Do we all mean the same thing when we say, well, so-and-so's a good person? Earlier this week, our presiding Bishop Michael Curry said quite correctly that there are good Episcopalians on every side of the political divide in which we currently find ourselves. And there are indeed good persons on every side of the current political discourse, fraught as it is in our country. And if we look at any occupation that exists in our society, there are good persons doing that work in the midst of every single occupation that happens in our country. When we look at any political agenda caught up in the midst of each and every political agenda that we have in our country right now, there are good people. Any activity we can think of, anything that's going down currently in our country, good people are in the midst of it. Good people are caught up in those realities. There's something more that we really need to consider. Because just because there are good people going about a certain occupation, that doesn't mean that that occupation is a good and godly occupation. Just because good people hold to a specific political agenda doesn't make that political agenda a good and godly political agenda. Just because there are good people caught up in a certain activity doesn't make that activity good and godly. That we have to consider both what is a good person and what is good and godly living. And the life of Matthew is one that really makes us reflect on this truth. So I want to start by saying that Matthew was consistently in his life someone we would consider a good person. Jesus is not going to call as a disciple someone who is not going about something in their life, in their internal workings, that is good. So Matthew was a good person. But we're not here celebrating Saint Matthew because Matthew was a good person. Matthew was a good person when he was going about the occupation of being a tax collector, which means he would set up his booth, and there would be an onus upon the community he'd set up his tax booth in to get so much money in each quarter for the Roman government. And the way Matthew would make money to live a rather luxurious lifestyle was by ensuring that the people gave to him more than they actually owed to the Roman government, and he got to keep the difference. And when it comes to the political agenda that Matthew was taking up right then in the midst of this, his political agenda was aligned with the Roman government, an overall oppressive force that was subjugating the Jewish people and other peoples all across the Mediterranean. A political agenda that eventually would result in the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, just a few decades after the events we're hearing about in the Gospel. And when we think about the activities that Matthew was caught up in, We hear these stories in the Gospels of these parties that the tax collectors would throw involving sex workers. We know that sex workers in those first centuries involved a lot of sex slaves, women trafficked for sex, many of them underage. So we already have a good person, Matthew, engaging in an occupation, a political agenda, and a whole series of activities that we know are not good and godly. So if Matthew had just been a good person, we would not be celebrating him today. We're celebrating St. Matthew today because he chose, in the midst of being a good person, to also discern and to answer a call towards a good and godly life. And that meant major changes for him. It meant leaving a very lucrative position where he had no question about his material needs not only being met, but being able to live luxuriously when it comes to material reality, to follow an itinerant rabbi who was basically homeless, went from eating the most lush and lavish foods to sometimes in the midst of hunger, simply pulling fruits and bits of wheat to put in his mouth so there's something in his belly as he's walking through fields, with no surety if he's going to have a roof over his head at night. He went from being in the midst of a political agenda that fully valued the Roman Empire and occupation and its oppressive and extortive practices, to following someone who would eventually be murdered as a dissident of the state, and leading the early Christian community, which was considered to be dissident and completely and utterly against what was considered the right political order. And he would go from participating in a culture of activities that relished and enjoyed the enslavement of innocent individuals to writing a gospel about the liberation of the oppressed and the freeing of all those held captives by the power of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So the reason why we are here today in the midst of a Principal Sunday worship celebrating the life and legacy of Matthew is not because he was a good person, but because he was a good person who took the time and consideration and followed the call to lead a good and godly life. And if we are to consider this process of saintly living to be something that we are going to engage in ourselves, then we must too enter into the same process. But all of us, as good persons, are hampered. We are limited in our perspectives. We see things just from our own lives. And strictly following any one specific group or any one specific preacher who says this is or this is not what we are supposed to do, we've seen over and over again how that can be fraught with danger itself. So what are the tools we have as Episcopalians in the midst of the reality we are currently facing in this country, in the midst of this political divisiveness, to sort of ground our discernment? And I think this is a time where we need to step back and ask ourselves, what is good and saintly living in the midst of this? And I think the key resources we have as Episcopalians from this come from two sources that are very much linked. One I would suggest everyone look at is called the Episcopal Public Policy Network, the EPPN, the Episcopal Public Policy Network. That is our lobbying organization in Washington, D.C. Yes, the Episcopal Church has one. And what they do is they take various statements made by our House of Bishops, various considerations made over past decades by the General Convention of the Episcopal Church, and they make policy statements. And they work with our legislature and our government agencies to try to implement the will of the Episcopal Church, the discerned thoughts of the Episcopal Church when it comes to public policy. You can go to their webpage and you can read their various statements on an entire variety of things. And that will give you guidance into what the Episcopal Church has deliberated over decades as being good policy. If you don't find what you're looking for there, if you want to go directly to the source, if you Google Episcopal Resolution Archive, Episcopal Resolution Archive, what you'll find immediately, first link in all probability, will be a link to a searchable database of every resolution that the General Conventions of the Episcopal Church has ever made. And we talk about a lot of things in the Episcopal Church. We have lots of opinions, and we've had lots of discourse. And there is not a political issue that we have not passed a resolution on at some point in the past 40 years. And these resolutions aren't the thoughts of one person, one bishop, one priest sitting in one parish saying what comes to their mind, like I'm doing right now. These are the careful deliberations of our clergy and lay leaders over decades. And there's multiple statements about issues like reproductive health and abortion, about gun control, about taxation, about health care, about environmental policy, about where we should be placing mining industries in the midst of our natural resources, about what does it mean for us to actually work for the equality and safety of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, gender expansive persons. All of these things and so much more are there in the midst of these deliberations of our General Convention. Now, as Episcopalians, we don't have to agree with any of them. We have our own conscience that we follow. And the question here isn't to do what they say. My prompt here is to take the time to sit back and listen to what the voices of our fellow Episcopalians have said over decades of thought, and ask ourselves, why do we agree or not agree with what they have done? So that we are leading our lives maybe not in the fullness of goodness and godliness, which is quite beyond us and something we hope to find through grace, but so that we are leading our lives in a way that recognizes and values the Episcopal community, the Christian community that we have decided to join and partake in as we go about our striving through God's grace to live a good and godly life amidst being the good persons that we are. Amen. For our call to action, aimed at what is right for September, and hope that you will come to support Team Rubicon. More information about our call to action and Team Rubicon can be found on our website. Please check for more there.